Inuka Nisisi, and we're really, really happy to be able to build on the momentum of Saba Saba that we started this journey last month, as we reflect on how far we have come as a nation and how much we need to do going forward. And of course, this month, we are all celebrating 10 years since we promulgated the Constitution. And I know that there's a whole mix of feelings. Some people feel, well, nothing has really happened. Some people are frustrated. Some people have lost the excitement that we once had. But as we really reflect on what it is that we have achieved, and we have achieved a lot in the last 10 years, I think this is a webinar series that will help us ground us in terms of looking back at the journey we have come, but also getting us all fired up again about the work that we have the privilege to do in the present times as we think about the future. Yesterday, Jedida Warohio led us in an amazing reflection on human rights and nationhood, very ably moderated by Hussein Khalid. And if you missed that, please go and look for it on the Nisisi Kenya YouTube. For me, it was something I actually listened to twice because it was really deep. It really grounded not just this series, but this conversation in particular. And I'm really, really grateful to both Jedida and Hussein for starting us off on such an amazingly wonderful note. And so today we're going to be talking about culture as the foundation of the nation. Which is Article 11 of the Constitution. I know many times when I point out to people that the Constitution actually says that the foundation, not a foundation, but the foundation of the nation is culture, I often get two reactions. One reaction is people who just say like, what? How come I've never seen that in the Constitution? Let me go and check it out. And then the other is people who say, those are just words. I mean, what does it really mean? When we say culture is the foundation of the nation, it sounds like these words are really nice words to say, but nobody really knows what it means. Nobody knows how do we translate that into our lived experience. It just becomes something that we like to say when we say we are a nation of diverse identities. So today we thought that we would actually think through what does it mean when Article 11 of the Constitution emphasizes that out of all the many things we could have said land is the foundation of this nation, and there are people who think it is. We could have said human rights are the foundation of this nation. We could have said many things are the foundation of the nation. What does it mean when Article 11 of the Constitution says, and I quote, the Constitution recognizes culture as the foundation of the nation and as the cumulative civilization of the Kenyan people and nation. And then, of course, Article 11 goes on to talk about the responsibilities of the state, or some of the responsibilities of the state with regard to this, and also the responsibilities of the people's representatives who are parliament. This, if some of you may have remembered even this Madaraka Day in his address to the nation, the head of state actually said, and I quote, culture is at the core of reimagining a national dream. So like I said, these are words that we know. I don't think anybody disputes it. The question is, what does it mean? And if we're going to be talking about constantly this responsibility to reimagine the nation, constantly this responsibility, as Article 3 tells us, to uphold, to defend, and to do everything we can with the Constitution, then the question is, do we understand what that means? I couldn't think of a better person to lead us and to catalyze our thinking on this, or to help us reflect deeper into our responsibilities as we get to the 10th anniversary of the promulgation of the Constitution, than Abubakar Zain Abubakar. Abubakar Zain has asked that I introduce him simply as a Kenyan storyteller. And indeed, you will see that what we will be doing today is going back and celebrating the gift that we have in stories and how stories can help us think through these deep things. So we'll be telling a lot of stories today, but more importantly, he also wants us to remember that he's not just a storyteller, but a storyteller who at the core of what he does remembers that it is about being Kenyan in all the various ways that this means. Kenyan as to do with this nation, but also our responsibilities within the world. Zane started out, so many people might remember, some people might remember this. His roots are very deep in the cultural sphere, in doing cultural work. He was one of the co-leaders of the Nairobi Theatre Academy after leaving university, where he was at Kenyatta University, where I had the pleasure of spending a lot of time beginning to work through these questions. He's currently completing a master's in peace education. But many of us would actually know Zane from his extensive work in the fields of policy and legislation. He served at the East African Legislative Assembly as a member representing Kenya. And then he also spent substantive amounts of time at Uraia Trust as the executive director, and more recently, leading Muhuri. But I think where we're going to spend the core of our time today is really reflecting on the work that Zane did as a commissioner with first the People's Commission of Kenya and then the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission, where he was amongst those who really worked to bring the question of culture to the forefront of the Constitution and also to what we do as a nation. So as I welcome Zane, I just want to say how much I'm personally really looking forward to this. We will use, just as a couple of housekeeping, we will structure this, as I said, using stories, and we're going to structure this in 3 parts. We'll start with reflecting on the past, where we have come from, understanding what culture means, understanding how we got from where we began to where we are today. We will look extensively at what the Constitution has to say about culture. And then we will begin to reflect on where we need to go within the present, but also towards the future. In between, I will be taking questions. So I encourage you, if you are on the Zoom webinar, please use the question and answer function. Feel free to keep chatting on the chat, but I'm going to request that you put your questions in the Q&A so that we're able to bring them up as we go along. And if you are on YouTube, feel free to put your questions on the comment section of YouTube, and we will be harvesting those questions so that we can bring them to Zane. And so I'm going to just jump straight into it. Thank you very much for joining us. Karibu, karibu, karibu sana Zane. And I want to just start it off, first of all, by welcoming you. And then do you want to say anything before I ask you, actually, what are we talking about? Because I'm really interested in knowing what do we mean when we say culture. But first, karibu.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your kind and generous introduction. But also, thank you, Inukani Nisisi, for bringing us together so that we can have a conversation as Kenyans, as Africans, as global citizens on matters that are very important to us. So I'm very, very happy to be with you today.
Thank you very, very much, Zane. And I just wanted to start by asking, let's first just set the grounds of the conversation. When we say culture, what do we mean? I think there are very many definitions out there. And yesterday, I was very happy to hear Commissioner Jijida talk about the importance of culture as a tool. And talking about what does it mean when we talk about a culture of integrity. I've referenced what the president said at the Madaraka Day speech. Some people say, okay, this is about the arts. Some people say this is about heritage. So let's just get our terms. I know we will talk about what the Constitution says, but when we use the term culture, what are you thinking about?
Okay, the concept of culture is obviously a contested concept, but there are certain attributes that people agree as to what it constitutes. You know, if you go very way back, you will know that the sources of the word culture comes from Latin origins in terms of cultivation. And at that time, people were thinking of cultivation and refinement of mannerisms, physical attributes, social attributes, and so on. But I think in our context, it is important for us to consider one of the first few scholars who articulated what they thought was culture was called Edward B. Taylor. And he published an interesting book called Primitive Culture, 1871. And then this was reprinted in 1958. And Taylor says that culture was a complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. And mind the language that he's using, that he wrote this in 1871. But to many African scholars, and we make a lot of references to Kenyan scholars, they have articulated various ideas about culture. So if you start with the number of scholars that I will refer to, what is common to them is that it is a complex continuum. It is about life. Culture is about how people adapt and adopt to their environment, how they negotiate rules of belonging, rules of living together, how they cope with their environment. So it is a sum total of all aspects of what life is. So it is a way of life. And if you consider, for example, Bethel Ogot, looking at it from a historical perspective, he makes the very interesting remarks concerning communities of people who have a sense of kinship, who have a sense of common history, who have a sense of common traditions, who have a sense of belonging, and who have a sense of being rooted in the environment under which they find themselves. But what I find very interesting about Ogot's ideas about culture is that Bethel Ogot talks about culture is not purist in its approach, at least within the context of African culture and Kenyan culture for that matter. And he produces evidence that before the arrival of Europeans to our land, people considered culture to be something evolving, and there were no exclusive identities the way we understand them now. And he gave examples of how the Maasai were interacting with the Kikuyu, and in many times you would not draw any distinctions, except when there is possibly war or there's tension between various sections of society. He gave examples of communities in the coast, in Western Kenya, in Rift Valley, and the idea of identity was always continually negotiated. So that is what I take from Professor God. If you talk about Professor, for example, Tabitha Karogo, who is an educationist, her work mostly was looking at how colonialism impacted on African culture and specifically women. And more recently, she's gotten into how it impacts on children. And what is common to Tabitha and Ogot is that they start from the premise that Africans had civilizations before the coming of the European. And this is consistent in many of the scholars, if you talk about what Ngugi talks about, or Ali Mazrui, or Michere Mugo, or Chesaina Serunji. I can go on and talk about Wangare Maathai, looking at it from an environmentalist point of view, and how communities created harmony with their environment. And the lack of tension made the environment survive and thrive. And where there is tension, then people will suffer if they do not create harmony between them and the environment. So in a sense, and in a nutshell, we can say culture is the sum total of all facets of life. And if you look at what Professor Osaga Odak or the late Mbiti talked about, from them, Osaga Odak, who was an anthropologist, draws a distinction that culture is also about cosmology. In other words, creating a sense of belonging in the context of a finite existence in an infinite universe. Meaning what? Meaning that communities and groups of people will have an idea of explaining the difficult questions of life. For example, where were you before you were born? For example, why are you here? What are you doing on this earth? For example, what will happen to you when you die? So these explanations of these questions that define that you have a finite existence, that there's a day you are born and there's a day you'll die, but the universe is endless. And people wanting to participate in this endless universe, then they come up with explanations that then later on, through repetition, through passing on from one generation to another, then they become traditions, they become mores, they become a way of life, they become lifestyles, they become fashion, they become custom. So let me finish by saying the following. In the two things which are very critical. One, before the interruption of African traditions, African cultures, African civilizations, there was advancement in many areas, in science, in medicine, in agriculture, in maritime science. A number of our societies were maritime societies. In other words, they had already conquered the seas, and they could be defined by today's terminology that they were global trotters. In other words, they could go to far away lands and come back and exchange. And in this exchange, it included culture. So interactions between different peoples and different cultures enhances and make the culture grow. So in a sense, all these scholars I've made reference to agree that culture is dynamic. Culture is not static. Culture is not something that is cast in stone. There are some things you give up, some new things you learn, and some new traditions grow, and people adopt new things. The other thing that is critical is that the process of locating African culture became problematic when the European arrived in our continent and in Kenya in specific terms. And this is based on this great idea people talk about, which became very oppressive, the doctrine of discovery. And they said they have to discover people. And when they were discovering people, some of them came here and found that people are very advanced. The societies were advanced, the cultures were advanced. In other words, they had thriving civilizations. So of course there was denial that there was civilization, there was culture, because you could not then oppress or become overlords over people who are already civilized. Because the cover of oppression and exploitation was took the face of a civilizing mission. You can only civilize those who are uncivilized. You can only give culture to those who are uncultured. So it became problematic because many people were then indoctrinated to believe that our cultural development began with the arrival of the other. And some people have bought into this indoctrination, and it has created dilemmas for them and contradictions in their lives. So to many of us who are in the field of culture, we believe that coming to terms with all aspects of our lives is important. And if culture then is understood to mean all these things about life, then you cannot gainsay and say, you cannot actually start debating, is it the foundation of a nation or not? Then the answer becomes obvious. But I would like to stop there.
Wow, you've said so many things, and I think among the things that's really important is this really broad space that culture occupies, so that it's not just arts, it's not just heritage, it's not just the expression of one person's identity or a group of people's identity. It really is all these things all coming together. And I also really like the point that you made, that culture is dynamic. And so it's not just something we inherit, and then people say our traditions do not allow us to do something, or it's not something that we say, well, this, we have always done this, but it's something that we can do something about. In fact, as you were speaking, I was reminded by what Frantz Fanon said, which is when he talked about a national culture, and he said, a national culture is the whole body of efforts made by a people in the sphere of thought to describe, justify, and praise the action through which that people has created itself and keeps itself in existence. Which leads me to my next question, that when we talk about a national culture and we talk about culture in the Constitution, we are talking about all the many different cultures of the different identities of who we are as Kenyan peoples. But we're also talking about this really deliberate and conscious effort, this journey that we have taken to create, to make, to say, who are we as a nation? Who do we want to be? Who do we want to become? What is it that when we envision ourselves as becoming? And so I want to go straight to that journey. I know you were very intimately tied into the journey. So I wonder if you could just very quickly take us through where it started, the journey of entrenching and putting culture in the Constitution. How did it begin? Did it begin? I know you are a member of the People's Commission of Kenya. I know you're a member of the CKRC. Perhaps let's just take the next 10 minutes to reflect on that journey. How did we get to the point where this became part of our Constitution?
Let me first affirm what you've said, and I've seen the comments by my brother, Obi Obiero Odhiambo. In no way did I start saying there's one African culture. There's no such thing. I think we will come to how do you engineer a national culture, but all communities have the same potential of developing their own cultural dimension. But let's start with Kenya as a concept. Of course, by the time the colonial government had taken over our country, by the time we were fighting for independence, by the time there was consideration that Kenya should become independent, there's a possibility that Kenya should become independent at some point. We had three distinct regions, or three distinct entities under the British influence. We had the Kenya colony, which most of the people know. We had what was called the Kenya Protectorate, which was mainly what you may say is the coastal strip, and we had the Northern Frontier District. So when discussions came about how do you create an independent nation, we did not become a nation by choice. People were brought together in many cases by force. And of course, today is not the time for us to spend time in terms of saying, talking about the impact of the Berlin Conference and creating boundaries and so on and so forth. But when we started negotiating, the British did not think it was important to have culture on the table of discussions for independence. Neither did they think it was important in the constitution making process then. So if you look at the process that led to the negotiations for the adoption of the independence constitution. First of all, those negotiations were not done in Kenya. So they were done outside the context of Kenya or African soil. They were done in Europe. They were done in Lancaster House. And there were 3 distinct conferences. So in terms of setting, that was a setting. But secondly, the discussion mainly focused on how can you live together, and you have very many distinct communities, distinct cultures, and distinct regions. So how can you live together? And the answer to that for the British was to make proposals based on British history, British traditions, British institutions, British law, and British governance structures. And really, in the African context, most of the African countries that got independence negotiated their independence and ended up adopting wholesomely ideas from the so-called mother country. In other words, the colonial power. So if you look at the British colonies, many of them inherited what later on people commented and called the Westminster model. And they were referring to the prime ministerial system with the Queen as head of state, and the prime minister, one who is first among equals, leading a cabinet. But what people fail to understand, and people readily talk about, is that this constitutional framework from Britain was inspired by British culture. So if you go back to founding documentations, for example, the Magna Carta, these were negotiations between sections of the community. And Magna Carta, in the meaning of the Great Agreement, is the well-known. Within the Great Agreement, there was a minor agreement, which is called the Forest Agreement. There you'll find a lot more interests of common people there in the Forest Agreement, because it was much more about people, ordinary people, if you like. In the Magna Carta, it was much more of class and class interest. So when we negotiated, in the end, they more or less gave us a template, which was to use, which they had used for a long time, with a few tweaking here and there. Secondly, when people went to negotiate this constitutional framework, they were deemed to be representatives of the people, but there were no consultations with the people as to what needed to be negotiated. So in the end, after the final one, to move fast, after the final agreement that led to independence, we ended up with the Westminster model, but we ended up with a constitution that had no reference to communities, with one exception. The constitution was based on individual rights. It did not, in that sense, when you talk about individuals, you don't talk about culture. It is about individuals. Culture is about communities. Culture is about a sense of belonging. Culture is about social interaction. The 1963 Constitution was based on individual rights. The only place where it deals with the question of community rights are only 2 places. One, in relation to those who profess the Muslim faith. And once people admitted that the system that was colonial and the new system that was being proposed was mainly Judeo-Christian in traditions, they said, okay, we will accommodate Muslims to ensure that they are able to practice their faith and their way of life. And that was the compromise to allow the NFD, large part of NFD and large part of cost, to be integrated into the main domain called Kenya, and constructing now a new country called Kenya. Now, given that it was mainly individual rights, you couldn't have found any references to community. So the second component that had close to community was, how do you deal with the question of what was later on to be called trust land? This trust land question was mainly land belonging to certain communities that the monarch said that these communities are not advanced enough to look properly after this land, that the monarch will look after this land on behalf of these communities as a trustee. And of course, they did whatever they pleased with the land under that jurisdiction. But if you understand that the connection, that power of the monarch was then transferred to the prime minister. And then later on, the power of the prime minister was transferred to the president. But the assumption was still there that these are backward people who cannot take care of themselves. They only have the right of occupation, not ownership. And they needed to be guided as children and to be helped to manage their own affairs and their own land. So the closest to come to this is those two components.
Okay, so that's the basis of the constitution that we...
Your mic is off, doctor.
It's actually
I can't
off.
hear you. Okay.
You can't hear us? Okay.
Now I can hear you.
Okay, that's the basis, therefore, of the constitution that we were given or inherited or whatever you want to call it in 1963. So fast track, and we want to now give ourselves, as the preamble says, a new constitution, a new agreement, a new covenant based on who we are as the peoples of Kenya. Could you walk us through that process?
Okay, so again, in summary form, people started agitating for a new constitutional order after, of course, the 1963 constitution was mutilated, and we transformed ourselves into a single-party dictatorship. And people started agitating for the reintroduction of multipartism and the transformation of our constitution. And at that point, discussions were begun in terms of saying, what kind of constitution do we need? So you could trace back to the movement of Kenya to Itakayo, model constitution, and also people were very concerned about process. And they said, this time we must have a participatory process, a process that involves the majority of our people, a process that allows for meaningful participation of these people, a process that allowed for all people to come in a voluntary process to have a long discussion about how do we want to become a nation and what kind of constitution will we bequeath to ourselves in terms of that process. What is important in terms of that discussion is that clearly people wanted a participatory process, a process that involved all Kenyans, but also we negotiated values for that process. And among those values, there was value of meaningful participation of the people, values of respect for the people, values of negotiations and consensus building. And some of these values that I'm referring to ended up becoming values in our constitution. So what was critical about this process was that there was, of course, a dilemma. And there was a dispute, and in summary form, there were two schools of thought. There was one school of thought that wanted to have experts to lead this process and come up with a constitution, and there were others like ourselves who wanted a people-driven or people-centered constitution-making process. And the first process was the first opportunity of meaningful dialogue among Kenyans on what it means to be a Kenyan. Where are we coming from? What is our history? How would we want to change? How would we like to have commitments that will allow us to live together? How do we become a nation? And this school of thought, of course, won the day. It was at that time those who were propagating for an expert-led, and people will recall Mzee Moi saying, how can an ordinary Kenyan make a constitution? This is a joke. How can Wanjiku, and he was giving an example, how can Wanjiku be asked to make a constitution? What does Wanjiku know? And this is where the concept of Wanjiku comes from. And people said, no, we will do it. There are ways of us doing it. But in a nutshell, the participatory approach won the day, and we then enacted, after long discussions, after making false starts after another, we then made a law that allowed us to have a participatory process. It is also important to note that every time we make progress, people will take us back a few steps. And that's why at some point there was conflict in the country, and there was then those who wanted to go on with the review process, and another group went to Fungamano and formed the People's Commission. But later on, the two processes merged into one, and we ended up coming up with one of the most participatory process in the world, and came up with tools and ways and means of translating ordinary Kenyans' lives into constitutional principles. And what is also important, some of the things that were done in terms of managing that process became minimum in terms of what participation means. For example, for the first time, we agreed that any Kenyan could come and make presentations to the review process, either in English or Kiswahili or any other Kenyan language, including sign language. Again, that became part of the constitution, that it is in the constitution now. We also agreed that we will then capture what people are saying based again on Kenyan history, where people will collect views and then not pay attention to them and come up with their own proposals. We agreed to record verbatim, audio visual, every presentation, every handover of a memorandum and a verbal presentation. And the sittings were done in every constituency. And there were civic education that was undertaken so that people understood each and every step of the process, and they meaningfully were able to give their views concerning what they want in their own constitution. So in terms of process, these are some of the dynamics. If you compare that with the constitution making process that led to independence, you would see that the people are not involved. In this context, the people are involved. So three quick things that are important in addressing this. It is the people themselves who wanted culture to be a central architectural design of the constitution. It's the people themselves. So then it is not shocking to find that based on the views of the people and the architecture of our constitution, Article 1 of our constitution is the sovereignty of the people. So again, recognizing who is sovereign. But it's the people themselves who say that. If people have an opportunity and they say it, then that's what they say. It's not the leader or the president who is sovereign. It's not parliament which is sovereign. It's not the judiciary that is sovereign. It's the people who are sovereign. And the sovereign power of the people can be exercised directly or through democratically elected representatives. Now, that idea of putting faith in the people is part of that cultural imperative. Secondly, that we mainstream some of these cultural ideas. They are mainstream. They are to be found throughout the constitution. And then thirdly, in the end, after a large struggle, and some people had to go to court and to demonstrate, but in the end, we agreed that whatever would be proposed will have to get the consent of the people through a referendum. So again, the people put their own stamp on the outcome and say, this is what we told people. We didn't get everything. We understand this is a negotiated document. There were many competing interests, but we built consensus on holistically what will take us forward as a nation. And that's what became the Constitution after the false start again of the rejected draft, but that's another story. We may get into it or not. But in the end, what is critical in this is that many of the cultural ideas in this Constitution came from the people themselves.
Thank you very much. That's really a lot to chew on. And I do want to go to a couple of questions that have come up and take that before we go on. And then I would like you to take us into what you have said, that a lot of these imperatives have been captured in the Constitution. Before we do that, you've alluded to it, and I do want to take that step back. I know we had several drafts of the Constitution, and you have spoken about the process, especially that produced the zero draft that CKRC then put in front of the Bomas conference. And I think an interesting thing happened at Bomas, right? And I wonder if you could talk to us about, if I recall, and please correct me, you're the expert on this, that the CKRC draft or the zero draft did not have culture so closely intertwined and embedded in it. And then the Bomas draft did. And I wonder if you could just walk us through that, and then what happened subsequently. And I know we don't have much time, but if you could just give us a summary of that, and then we'll take some questions and then come back to really looking at how then, apart from Article 11, and you've begun already to speak a little bit about this, how then is culture at the heart of the Constitution that we have today?
Okay, so let me start first by saying that what is interesting is that in terms of participation, when we did it wasn't actually zero draft. It was a proper CKR draft that was published in accordance to the law. But when we were now analyzing, you know, the process of collecting views is one, collecting views now, how do you bring them together is another, and then drafting the Constitution is another. The first hurdle, of course, was at the drafting stage. No one disagreed that Kenyans had many ideas touching on culture. At the design of the Constitution and the drafting, it became a bit problematic, because majority of those who are trained, legally trained in the British system, could not see where would you put culture? How do you put culture in a Constitution? And to them, culture was such a vague idea that you could not put in the Constitution. So it was an uphill task in terms of the drafting part. Although we had a very amazing expert attached to the Kenyan team, Professor Crab from Ghana. Professor Crab from Ghana was a celebrated legal scholar in the continent and outside, in the Commonwealth as well, and an expert drafts man, that's the term, and he taught many of the people who are involved in drafting, legal drafting, across the Commonwealth, from Great Britain to the West Indies, to the continent and so on. The good thing about that old man, God bless his soul, was that he was also a griot. He was also a master storyteller and a keeper of his people's memory. And he was an expert on the stories of Anansi in the Ghanaian context. So he said, yes, it can be done. Let's try and do. The second hurdle became some of the commissioners who are also trained in the legal way, some, not all, who are also saying, no, we don't want to do those kind of experiments. So in a nutshell, the CKRC draft did not have adequate cultural input. The closest there was to a broad cultural input was the establishment of a chapter called Directive Principles of State Policy. And in there were some ideas of values. not all of them, but ideas of values that have cultural implications. But when we went to Bomas, that is the national conference, because people say Bomas, but technically Bomas just meant the Constitutional National Conference. And the delegates to the conference felt that it was a good draft, but there were two areas that needed major rethinking and major rewriting. And that is on culture and on devolution. And the conference then, in its wisdom, established two ad hoc committees, one on devolution and one on culture. And the one on culture, the convener was the late Professor Wangari Maathai, who was ably assisted by the late Nakitare, who was a former director of culture. And it had attracted interest on cultural proponents, but also people who are opposed to culture, some religious leaders, some women groups, and also some representation from persons with disability, because they said, in our culture, given the context of our culture, we have some very oppressive traditions concerning women and concerning persons with disability. And some of the clergy were worried about opening up space for African religions and maybe the demonization of other religions that people consider they came from outside the continent. But in the end, we arrived at a consensus that given that culture is dynamic, it's progressive, there are some ideas that can be adopted and some ideas that can be outlawed if they are oppressive or discriminatory, but all inclusive, because again, we recognize that Kenyans are not from one culture. There are many communities in Kenya and many cultures in Kenya. And what people are referring to as African culture, sometimes it's a summarization of patterns in terms of looking at different communities. So we agreed that given that nature, we will recognize principles and values, and we will recognize all communities, but we will also provide lenses that transcended the individual rights approach from the British in 1963. So if you look at our constitution, it has a place of the individual, it has a place for the family, it has a place for the community, and it has a place for the nation. And hopefully that the values that are then inculcated in the constitution will be used as a foundation of building a national culture. So all four dimensions are covered. So we have moved away from just individual rights to family, to community, to national, and that Kenyans should be free to partake in a culture of their choice. No one should be forced to partake in a particular culture. It is a free will of individuals to partake in whatever cultural life that they want to take part in. So based on those recommendations, of course, the position of culture was enhanced, and we not only mainstreamed culture throughout the constitution, but we also had a specific chapter dedicated to culture. And then there was also a specific chapter dedicated to values. So both, if you read both of them, so there are three dimensions: a chapter on values, a chapter on culture, and then the mainstreaming of cultural principles and values across the constitution.
So this is what came out of in the discussion in Bomas, and then we do know that we lost some of that when in the WACO draft and subsequently. And I don't know if you want to say anything about that, or should I go? Can I go to the question?
Quickly, it is important to say it that after the Bomas draft included all that, politicians met with their advisors, mainly British-trained lawyers or lawyers trained in British system in Naivasha. And one of the casualty of the negotiations was to remove the chapter on culture and to remove a large chunk of the chapter on values. The proposed constitution of 2005, popularly known as Wako draft, removed all that. So after it was rejected and the committee of experts were appointed, in the harmonized draft, limited aspects of that were returned, including a shorter version of the culture chapter. But again, after the harmonized draft was debated, again, the technical people removed the chapter again, and we ended up with the proposed constitution of 2010, which has that famous Article 11 and a few others. But luckily, many of the conceptualization principles and values, which were then mainstreamed in other chapters across the Constitution, were left intact. So those ones were left intact, and I think they are the legacy that we have in our current Constitution. Comparatively, if you look at that and compare to other African constitutions, many of them will not have that. But we have several components of these cultural imperatives and principles and provisions in the Constitution that are remaining intact.
Thank you very much, Zane. And I think I wanted us to go through that history. And I think it's really important that you've given it to us, because what comes through to me is this tension between the people, what the people want in many different ways, not just in terms of content, but in terms of process. And then the tension with it being taken away, whether it is through the politicians or through the professionals, in this case, the lawyers. And so we constantly have that tug between, and I think it's a tug of war that we continue to see today. And often when you hear people talking today about what's wrong with Kenya, we keep getting back to that question of our problem is that we have a bad culture, we have an immoral culture, or, you know, Kenyans are just bad, that's the way we live. So I thought it was really important for us to go through that. I want to go to some of the questions, and I think a number of those questions will actually lay the ground for where we want to go. But let me just, let's just connect with what people are saying. Obiobero Dhiambo, and I think you have addressed this, had asked about where we place this term African culture. And he made the point that culture, and in his opinion, is an expression of a homogeneous community that Africa is not. And so when we talk about Africa as if it is indivisible, that this is problematic. John Mukeni made the observation listening to you that, is this where the rain started to beat with us with the British presence here, or else, and he was looking in terms of culture and how that has continued to affect us all the way to the present. Obi also asked us if the understanding of, quote, Kenyan people premises on Kenya as a geographic entity or an abstract. Was there an understanding whether those born or those who live or those who belong to different ethnicities associated with Kenya, how do we relate with this? And what was the concept of, actually, when we say Kenya, what was the concept of Kenya that we are thinking through there? I wonder if you wanted to just comment on any of those three before I put a couple of other questions together.
Let me start answering all the three in a roundabout way. Mm-hmm. So some of these questions obviously came up.
Yeah.
And when they came up, majority of the people who made submissions to the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission and to the Committee of Experts made several proposals to the process. And in the processing of them, at some point, for example, people wanted all communities of Kenya to be named. Mm-hmm. Kenyans were saying that these mythical 42 communities 41 communities plus a category called other is not true. And I'm pointing this out because it creates a dilemma, that the kind of dilemma Obi is talking about, because it's a conceptualization issue.
Yeah.
So the conference, people made recommendations, and they even tried to list those communities. And of course, there were already disputes about, does it exist, or is this group distinct from this group, and so on. But the consensus in the end, if you look at the cultural report, the report of the Cultural Ad Hoc Committee at the National Constitutional Conference, at the end, it has a schedule which has names of communities. But after long deliberations, people agreed and said, no, you see, let us not name them for the following reasons. The first one, who says we are, all of us here, competent to name these communities? What if we name and put in the constitution, and then people come up and say, you left us out? So we said, that is one of the problems. The second problem is, it should be people who define themselves. Okay? And not the state or other people defining them. So there is a community in Kenya that was labeled by the British Malakote, meaning vagabonds, people who are like to roam around aimlessly. And yeah, and if you ask them, they say, no, that is not our name. Thirdly, we understood, in the sense of what Professor Gott was talking about, that social interaction and social processes can give birth to new communities. And communities that were given examples as Wataveta, communities like Waluya, communities like Kalenjin, they didn't exist. They became social constructs. As I said, look, let us agree on a process that will allow for recognitions of Kenyan communities, not some state officer sitting somewhere to make choices based on discretion, but establish an institutional framework. That is why that culture, the cultural chapter, established a culture, a commission on culture, and that will be a constitutional commission. Now, in the absence of that, people are saying that Parliament shall make legislation. But as somebody has already noted, that the legislative agenda is very slow, and that sometimes it is conceptualized in contradiction to the Constitution. In other words, the Constitution is much more progressive, and the legislative structure is less progressive. And one of the reasons that is so is because people were trained to think in British legal system thinking. It's very difficult for them to conceptualize how culture then become an important national process or concept or imperative. So again, maybe those who are working in the cultural sectors like ourselves, we have dropped the ball because we needed to provide leadership on this. But secondly, that the question of should it be limited to boundaries created by the British called Kenya? That was a big debate, but the majority and the consensus was that we should not go the Ethiopian way and say provide for a mechanism for self-determination. We who are storytellers know that one of the rules of storytelling is that if you start with an interdiction, there will always be a violation. In other words, if you provide for a mechanism for self-determination, it will be used at some point. Somebody will say, let's use it, it's there. Why is it there if it's not for using? But in lieu of that, they said, okay, let's balance that with a devolved system of government that will allow for autonomy of various regions, various geographical spaces in Kenya to be able to make determinations of issues that make fundamental impact on their lives. So the principle of subsidiarity, in other words, people making decisions where it affects them directly, was then ingrained in the constitution. And it was hoped then, by allowing for autonomy, by allowing for equality, by allowing for equity, then we will be able to live together. But those who are saying that undermine the principle of equality, undermine the principle of equity, undermine the principle of devolution, undermine the principle of inclusion, then those are the ones who are renewing the debate of saying maybe we should also have a provision for self-determination. And in this debate of resource allocation, that has come up again and again, and I've seen somebody already making reference to that. And then lastly, in terms of saying, what do we do with this? Let's remember what we were saying, that culture is not static. Culture is dynamic. Culture can change. Culture can grow. And that values that we are seeking to enhance are hoped for at the individual level. Somebody will have a choice in terms of what culture they want to partake. What cultural life do they want to manifest themselves? At the family level, the same applies. At the community level, it applies the same way. And then at the national level, this is where social engineering is required. Because we have provided a template of national values, not only in Article 10 of our Constitution, but in every substantive chapter, substantive, with the exception of maybe 3. You have a situation where you have values and principles. So we start with values and principles. And we are then hoping that with those cultural imperatives and values that have been provided for in the Constitution, and we had hoped an institutional base, which was in the chapter which was taken away, we are now supposed to work to establish a culture commission or mechanism of some sort of implementing these values, so that when we then grow these values and implement them and embrace them and live them, then they become the Kenyan values. So I hope in that long-winded way, I have answered some of these 3 questions.
I think you've answered some of the questions, and they continue to come, and so we'll keep coming back to some of them. Just quickly going through the questions, I think we have 2 sets of questions. There's a whole set of questions that have to deal with what's the way forward, and some of them in that case are looking at what's going on in the present, saying that, okay, we hear what you're saying about the Constitution, but when we look at our reality, we are seeing something different, whether it is abused by the state, or we need to think a little bit more about certain areas where, you know what you said, some things were taken back and we need to figure out how to bring them on board. However, I have a couple of questions that really take us to what does the Constitution say, apart from Article 11, that has to do with culture? So I'm going to read a couple of those questions and then just ask you if you could take us through what does the Constitution say, especially bearing in mind this particular sets of questions. Kimani Njogu is wondering if you could comment on Kiswahili as the language of creating the nation. And we know that the Constitution actually specifically speaks to the question of language and the question of Kiswahili in particular. And he also asks, he says, thank you, Zane, for this very vital journal that you're giving us. And then he asks, especially in relation to devolution, should legislation on culture be handled by the Senate, or should it be handled by the National Assembly? And Stine Njoroge, and I think here we're also talking about in terms of what institutions and how do we bring culture to life, asks, if culture is such an integral part of the heart of our Constitution, how come the ministry is relegated to matters that pertain to social services, gender, sports, or national heritage. So I'm wondering if we can use those three questions as a basis to just talk about what does the Constitution actually say about culture? You've alluded to some of that. And then we can come to the questions on what can we do, or what needs to be done, what, questions to do with BBI and so on and so forth. But what does the Constitution say?
Okay, so if we started going article by article, it become longer than we have time for. So what I'll try and do is to do a sketch map. It's a mapping exercise in terms of principle setting. So the first one is that we start with the preamble. And in the preamble, there are certain ideas, cultural ideas. So for example, we admit that we are a nation of many communities. For the first time, we admit that. This is the departure from the colonial trying to straitjacket us and make us individuals. And we say we accept our diversity and we celebrate this diversity, right? And we seek to work together to build one nation and with the appreciation of all these diversities. So one of the principles of the cultural imperative is that appreciation. First, admission that we are a nation of many communities and many diversities. And secondly, that we appreciate all of them. And that thirdly, the value that we are going to work to live together. To live together. Then in the same preamble, there's the idea that there are people who struggle for justice in the past. Again, this is a cultural idea, that there are values of people who struggle to change a system that is unjust to a system that is just. And we celebrate them. We also celebrate the heritage of our nation and our environment. And then we make a commitment, again, this is common to most cultures, because it is the essence of perpetuation of culture, that we are trustees on behalf of generations yet to come, and that we will do the best that we can to protect the interest of generations that are yet to be born and yet to come. And that we are also understanding this idea of being trustees, more guardians. So if you start deconstructing the preamble itself, it is loaded with cultural imperatives. Then the first article of our constitution, which I made reference to, which is the sovereignty of the people, it's the people who should decide. It's the people who are important. It's not individuals, it's not leaders, it's the people. But if you then consider what then happens next, after saying the sovereignty of the people, the supremacy of the Constitution, and the defense of the Constitution, then we go to define who these people are in terms of saying, establishing the republic and defining what kind of republic do we want to establish. Republic that has language. And on the question of language, people look at it in a restrictive term. First of all, it's a republic that has values. So in Article 10, we have established national values in the republic. So we have established values for the republic. And then under the republic, we also establish symbols and other binding features of culture. And one of them, of course, is language. So what have we provided for in the language? First of all, is the highest honor is then bestowed to Kiswahili. Why is the highest honor bestowed to Kiswahili? Because then it has dual primacy. It is both our national language and the only one. That's the only national language. And we've said it's a national language, it's an African language. It is that which binds us together. So it has the highest honor of being our national language. In the past, a national the language was Kiswahili, but it did not have the second honor, which is it also an official language together with English. It's an official language together with English and Kenyan Sign Language. So again, you have expanded already there the idea of what are official languages. So there are 3 official languages: Kiswahili, English, and Kenyan Sign Language. And already you have expanded by sign language by saying people with disability of this kind can also have an official language that they understand. It's not just sign language, it's Kenyan Sign Language. There's a difference. And then we have also brought Braille later on in the Bill of Rights. But there is another honor that is given to all Kenyan languages. This is for the first time a reference to Kenyan languages. And why are languages important? Languages are not the only means of communication and transmission of ideas or messaging and coding and encoding and decoding messages. Languages are also repositories of wisdom, collective wisdom. They are repositories of education, of science, of technology, of history, of record, of memory. So if you go back to Ngugi's argument about language and how language can be used to oppress or to liberate, this is an act of liberation. So that is part of the Republic. And then within the Republic, we also define what are national symbols. And then if you go, you'll be made reference to the schedules, you'll find the flag, you'll find the national anthem, you'll find, and the national anthem both in English and Kiswahili. So let me mix this provision with some of the challenges that already people are pointing out. 10 years down the line, we don't have a Kiswahili version of the Constitution. 10 years. 10 years down the line, you cannot receive full government services in Kiswahili because there are some forms that are not yet in both. They have tried. Many forms now have both in English and Kiswahili for the ones applying for passport, for ID, for a number of things they are. But there are some forms that are still only in English. But also government services, there are some places you go and you speak Kiswahili, it becomes a problem of communication. What we were looking out for was a path of development that government will then establish on how to make sure that the state comply with this requirement of language. What do I mean? An example is Canada. Canada has duality of 2 languages that are formal languages, English and French. And you cannot serve in the public service in Canada if you can't speak both. Although French is only predominantly used in one province, but you must have both. In Kenya, that must become our aim, to make sure that the status given to language, Kiswahili, particularly as a national language and as a formal language, is actually then implemented. But after the Republic, then we define citizenship. Okay, and then within that, we had challenges in terms of equality of citizenship and so on. So you go on and you go to the Bill of Rights and you find rights there that have to do with culture. But let me back up a little bit and say 3 things. One, that the challenge that we are being told, how come the government is still having Ministry of Culture and this, and gender and this, Ministry of Heritage and this, and so on. When we talk about that, what is the problem? The problem is the mindset. The problem is not the Constitution. In other words, what we are saying is that those people who were there in the past system of governance are replicating the past system of government as if the constitution has never been changed. During the time of Moi, when we had the old constitution, there was a Ministry of Women, Gender, and Culture, and fused together, and sports. They're still doing the same thing. In other words, there is lack of imagination. Again, this is a cultural imperative. And two, lack of change of mindset. And three, that our legislative structures are still captured in the old system. But then the question is, we who are in the cultural sector, what have we done to change this mindset? The second aspect I wanted to raise is the question of when we are defining the republic. This is where you now come across that famous Article 11, which talks about the cumulative civilization. And you know, the choice of words were very careful then done. When you talk about cumulative and you talk about civilization, what is the difference between civilization and culture? Civilization is the highest attainment of social, cultural development. And it is a statement by Kenyans that we had our own civilizations, and we honor those civilizations. And those civilizations are the cornerstone of our being, of our sense of belonging. And based on that architecture, it gives us the lenses of going forward in future struggles by saying, first of all, acknowledging who we are and where we're coming from. And we do not want to get into this debate. Were there civilizations before the arrival of the other or before discovery? We say that it is a constitutional principle. Yes, there was civilization. Cumulative in the sense of one generation passing to the next, this generation passing to the future. And I made already the aspiration in the preamble of saying we are trustees and we want to uphold the interest of those who are not yet even born. Why is this important? It's important because now, for the first time, have we not only, we cannot recognize the languages of Kenya without recognizing the communities of Kenya. So let me go forward and then touch on a few others because I know time is going. One is that people may think that chapter like environment and the chapter on land have no cultural components. So the constitution review processes benefited a great deal from the knowledge and experience of the late Professor Okoth Ogendo. Professor Okoth Ogendo was not only a land expert, but he was also one of the people who had researched greatly on traditional land tenure systems. In other words, land tenure systems of very many different African communities or Kenyan communities in Kenya. And he knew the distinction between those. And in one of his scholarly work, The Tenants of the Crown, he analyzed the ideas of the British concerning land and in their own country and how they conceptualize land in Kenya. And the idea that Africans are not endowed enough to be responsible enough for their own destiny on their own land. And a large component of land that was categorized as owned by the communities in Kenya became what was called trust land. And that land, which became trust land, was then placed at the hands of the crown to be administered on behalf of those people. Later on, it became in the hands of the prime minister and then the president. And we know how much the crown abused that power and how much previous presidents abused that power. So in this constitution, there are only 3 categories of land that are recognized. 1, private land, 2, government land, and 3, community land. And we had great debate of people who wanted to say there should be no category at all. Land should be collectively owned by all Kenyans. And of course, the majority of the people opposed that idea. They were not ready for that idea. So the transformation of this to return community land or trust land back to the ownership of communities. And one of the classification of defining a community land is ethnic identity. So the connection between identity and land is already there. And some of these are now administered by county governments. Do they understand that they have become trustees? I don't know. Are they abusing this right? Absolutely. Many of the lands that are now coming, their tenure is expiring. People want to use shortcuts and not involve the people. It was deliberately done in that way. The land that was under lease ownership, we had situations where you had land, somebody owning with a lease of 999 years. That is 1,000 years minus 1. How many generations are those? So again, a debate was to say, should we completely remove all leases, with other examples of Zimbabwe and other countries? Majority of the people did not want that. Should we reduce it to 50 years? Majority of people saying that is also unfair. Then the question came up, what is fair for now? It's 99 years. And some of those years have expired. That is why you have big companies that own hold leases of tracts and tracts of land are now busy trying to change the constitution so that they can have the same old procedures of owning or leasing land. And ideally, that land that has gone to community, if you want to lease it, then there should be negotiations between you and the community, the people, the county government, and you who want to lease. And the people might decide, no, we don't want to lease it. We want to redistribute it. Again, the question of ownership of land and size of land came up. And the majority of people, Kenyans, said, it is not fair for people to own thousands of acres and others to own nothing. And people are not adventurous enough to put the limit in the constitution. And the reason given was that it will be very difficult to change. You'd rather than say, Parliament shall enact a law to establish ceilings of ownership. To date, Parliament has not enacted such a law. So I'm comparing, I'm trying to show you some of these aspects, but let me very quickly mention a few others. One, of course, in the Bill of Rights, there are several rights in relation to culture, in relation to people benefiting from their heritage and material culture, having ownership of creativity. Language is protected, information is protected, the right to associate is protected. You may not think it is directly related. The right of visitation is protected, historical visitation, but also the right of establishing alternative conflict resolution mechanisms. And here we had in mind that there are cultural conflict resolution mechanisms. But having said that, let me say 3 things and then allow for more interaction. One, we agreed that all the cultural imperatives and things that are allowed by the Constitution shall be guided by the values of the Constitution. In other words, any cultural practices or values that are in contradiction of the Constitution, they'll be void to that extent of contradiction. And this provision was put there admitting that there are some retrogressive aspects of certain cultures. Certain cultures we cannot wait for cultural processes to weed out oppressive or discriminatory practices. We have outlawed them, those which are not in conformity with the values and architecture and design and provisions of this Constitution. Secondly, that we are expecting in future a lot of work will be done now to bring some of these cultural provisions in the Constitution into practice and into implementation. And then thirdly, some of the challenges that we're facing. So if you look at, for example, the framework of implementing the Constitution, we established a Constitutional Implementation Commission that had a lifespan, a finite lifespan, and the possibility of extending its term. Parliament, in its wisdom, or lack of it, in our opinion, they decided to not renew the term of the Implementation Commission fairly early, and the Constitution has not been implemented fully. Secondly, there is reluctance among politicians to implement this Constitution with fidelity. And they have been violating this Constitution with impunity. Therefore, if they are violating all aspects of the Constitution, you'll expect also the provisions on culture to be violated as well. And the social engineering and imagination that is required to build a national culture based on the constitutional base of values established by this Constitution has not happened at all. And that begs the question, whose responsibility is it? And Dr. Mshai, you made reference to Article 3 of our Constitution, which in part deals with the question of upholding, respecting, and obeying the Constitution. But the second part is to protect that Constitution. So every time people are talking about protection of the Constitution, we are not thinking of protecting the cultural aspects of this Constitution. And lastly, I think lack of knowledge is dangerous, because not very many people know this cultural base of this Kenyan Constitution and its liberative and transformative potential. And if people knew, then we may have found interesting ways of seeking to implement and to make those provisions come alive.
I absolutely agree, and I'm really grateful to you for giving us such a good basis to keep up these conversations going. We do have quite a number of questions, so what I'm going to do is going to group them, and so that we can hopefully get through all of them before we have to wrap up within about half an hour's time. And some of it touches on what you're saying. I know you weren't able to go through the full Constitution, but let me start with John Mukeni, whose questions have to do really with the question of resources. And one of his questions, for example, is how can cultural leadership help to stop intersectional inequalities of our people? And another question is just referring to the revenue allocation debate that's happening at the moment. And he notes that he does not see any allocation of culture. But I wonder if you could just say something to do with inequalities, to do with revenue allocation, especially the fact that, and we know this, that the state never seems to have any money for culture. I think you need to unmute.
Sorry. The first one is that the Constitution establishes the principle of equality, or not only individuals, but all communities. But we come from a Kenya with a history. This history where there are those who wanted to inherit the privilege of colonial forces. and white privilege to be transformed in community privilege. And this will be associated with the president, the person who has enormous powers, and the community from which the president comes from would want to claim to have special status and to be more equal than others. That is part of the history. So the first equalizing principle is that all communities will be treated equally. But because we have admitted that we come from a history of marginalization, a history of exclusion, a history of exploitation, we also included the principle of equity. And in this principle of equity, we talked about bringing into national discourse, but also national participation of regions, of communities that suffered marginalization in the past. In other words, we have a duality of things that we want to do. One is to treat everybody equally, but also take into account that not everyone was treated equally in the past or can be treated in the future except through the constitution, where we establish an equalization process. Why am I saying it's an equalization process? Because some people talk about equalization fund. Equalization fund is only one aspect. There are three broad aspects in terms of equalization. If you look at the Bill of Rights, you will keep on hearing when we talk about, for example, women, for minorities, for marginalized communities, for people with disability, for youth, we'll say the state shall put in place administrative, legislative, and other measures to address past inequalities. So again, as a nation, we have failed to put this in place. Administrative, legislative, and other measures in making sure that everybody then is given equal opportunity, and those who are left behind are given extra resources to bring them to the same level as others. Secondly, the reference of resource allocation, a lot of people are talking about a formula. There is no formula in the Constitution. The Constitution makes reference to basis, a basis. A basis. A basis, again, is a process. You take into account the circumstances, you take into account levels of poverty, you take into account levels of inequality in terms of provisions of social services, health, education, and other social services, roads network, and so on. So if you were to look at all these various components, then that is what forms the basis. But the third component is that devolution has been given functions. And in the Constitution, the functions are established through a principle that finance follows functions. This is a principle established in the devolution chapter and in the public finance chapter. But yet we have not implemented that. And then lastly, and not least, the Constitution, when you talk about provisions of what is the rightful share, the Constitution establishes two parameters. The first one is that not less than 15%. Now, this is what people call the floor. In other words, you can't go below 15%. But it doesn't put a ceiling. It establishes a principle of floor, but not establish a principle of ceiling. So you could even go to 95% being distributed to the county governments. 95%. you could do that. Why? Because in the functions that are allocated, largely the functions of national government are standard setting, policy directing, and not implementation, with the exception of functions that are not devolved. So even the functions that are not devolved are not getting their fair share. So the judiciary the judiciary function is not devolved, but the judiciary is still complaining it's not getting its fair share. And the national government take the approach that they are charitable by giving a county government more than 15%. So in this discussion, it is disingenuous to think that the national government is the one who have been given these resources. Don't forget what we said. Finance follows functions. So if finance was following functions, the large share or the lion's share would then be given to county governments. And last but not least, those who are obsessed with this equalization fund, the equalization fund is 0.5% of the budget. 0.5%. So it won't make big difference, and you start saying, oh, let us not do right by the main sharing mechanism basis and leave it to the 0.5%. That is unconstitutional, in my opinion. I don't know if that covers that particular question of resource allocation.
I think that does. Thank you very much. A couple of questions, other questions. Michael Karinga says, are there forces that are actively trying to engineer Kenyan contemporary culture? What are they? And then Razna, in much the same vein, notes that the government seems to have a very static view of culture. And you know, every Jamhuri Day we see ethnic dances, and many of those dances have not evolved since 1963. So she asked, when culture is reduced to tribal dances or choirs devoted to extolling the virtues of the president, how can we as a nation promote culture and the arts, which are dynamic, context-driven, and quite often supported by the state? And I want to add to that, Tini Njoroge's question. He notes that the culture policy, we still don't really have a culture. We don't have a culture policy 57 years on after independence. And what is the best way forward? So can you talk a little bit about culture and the arts? I know we're running out of time, but just very quickly, those three questions.
I think the major problem is those who are in culture and understand culture are not in policy. And those who are in policy have no clue about culture. So they think culture is hiring praise singers. Culture is a museum piece of clothing people in title skirts to come and jiggle their feet while somebody is hurrying them along as if they are herd of cattle. So that is where the dilemma is. And I think in terms of making progress, I think we who are in culture, and my brother Obi Obiero will remember that he and friends tried to establish a place where people in culture will also explore ways of saying, how do we influence policy? The reason we were so many of us who are cultural practitioners in the original CKRC is because we deliberately wanted to participate in that. And the Mizizi Cultural Center, headed by Obi Obiero then, invited Professor Osaga Odak for an earlier conversation and saying, if we were to write a Kenyan constitution using cultural lenses, how will we do it? That presentation is amazing. I hope Obi and others can digitize that presentation and put it back in line. And based on that conversation, we then had a strategic meeting with Kangara Jambi, Obi Odhiambo, Kimani Wawanjiru, Professor Kimani Njogo, others, a lot of us, and said, how best can we influence the constitution making process? And we said, we must be on the table. We must be in the process. So at any given opportunity, we brought cultural workers on board, including in making sure that the process is consultative. We got Professor Kimani Njogu and his team to do translation of most of those documentations into Kiswahili. And Kenyan could access both documentations of the constitution making process in Kiswahili and in English. So that expansion. So it's a challenge to us who are committed to making this constitution come alive. It's a challenge to us. Secondly, we must seek to transform government. There's no choice about that. Like Barack Obama said, there is no distinction between activism and mobilization and organizing in the community and leaving politics to politicians. If you leave politics to politicians, the outcome will be the same. If you leave the so-called technocrats who have no clue about culture, then you have the same problem. So in other words, we must roll up our sleeves. We must ensure that the civic education program that is ongoing, has been going on for the last 20, 30 years, has a cultural component. Let me give you an example. When we started as activists and cultural workers, rejecting the idea that there's a few individuals who monopolized the idea that they're the ones who fought for independence. People started the idea of rejection of naming individuals after national struggles or processes. Based on those struggles from RPP days, that is what led to the transformation of Kenyatta Day into Mashujaa Day in our constitution. So you can actually show a direct relationship between struggle and outcome, and between conceptualization and implementation. So we dropped the ball after the constitution was enacted because we thought of the following. One, some people are tired. They said, we struggled so much, we have now gotten it. And there was a sense that there was a promise that the constitution, once adopted, will fix all our problems. It will be a panacea for all our problems. That was a wrong assumption. That is a wrong hope to give the people. Secondly, some people thought the constitution is self-executing. It's not. It needs good men and women committed to change and transformation, dedicating their lives to working hard to implement and bring into life the provisions that have been provided for and the promise that has been made in this constitution. But thirdly, there was a creeping idea that we have made so much progress, reversal is not possible. But these 10 years have shown us reversals is serious. Non-compliance to the constitution is a serious problem. Lack of fidelity in the implementation of the constitution is a serious problem. So we need to get back into the trenches like we are doing now and say, how do we do this? And then lastly, research is critical. Creativity and creation is critical. And making sure what we research on and what we create has large accessibility to the people of Kenya. And there is a whole generation of Kenyans who do not know the history of struggle. We have a challenge of legacy. In other words, how does one generation bequeath to the next generation the power, the know-how, and the commitment for resistance and for protecting what we have already gained and for creating more opportunities for growth. So I hope that answers broadly in terms of principles those set of questions.
Thank you very much. And yes, I think you take us into now thinking about so many things. Something that's on the table, and I know it's a little bit difficult to talk about because we actually do not have the BBI proposals right now, but there are all sorts of conversations. And Razna Wara is curious that, one of the proposals that we hear about is that the BBI has advocates for a national historian. And so she wonders what your thoughts would be on that, given that those who write history are often the victors. Wondering, is this a necessary position? How does it compensate for the fact that history has been downgraded from the school syllabus? So really, what do we do with this question of a national history in relation to culture? John Mukeni has asked about the question of cultural centers. So if we're thinking about institutions, education institutions, the fact that we should have cultural centers and what you think about that. And then I just wanted to tie that to Betty Okero is, I guess, wondering aloud, how do we reconcile our sovereignty and the current overreach by the political elite in terms of hijacking our katiba, using our, and so how do we, is it possible to use our power through the popular, quote, popular BBI to rewrite our governance culture, values, and individual rights? So questions about the possibility of changing the constitution through BBI, but also questions about institutions of culture, both education and then that question of cultural centers.
Okay, so let's start with the question of official historian. I think, okay, before I go into it, I say we are discussing this based on what they published and not what they are yet to publish as BBI. So they published this idea of creating a position of a national historian. That's a very bad idea. In fact, it is contrary to the architecture of the Constitution and the principle of sovereignty of the people, the principle of independence of conscience, of freedom of association, freedom of acquiring ideas, and so on. We had this kind of thing during the Kano era and the first years of independence. People who wanted to capture the imagination of the nation by telling lopsided, sometimes complete falsehoods about our history. And the danger of establishing a custodian, one center of knowledge about what our history is about, is that that will be a state version of the history. And the state version will be of that person. So we must learn from our mistakes. And my question is, the Constitution has provided for a commission, an independent constitutional commission, that the same politicians were rejecting, but now they want an individual who can be controlled. We had hoped to establish constitutional commissions to do three things. One, to protect the sovereignty of the people. Two, to protect the Constitution. And three, to promote it. Those constitutional commission and independent offices, majority, almost all of them, have been captured by the state. And none of them is doing the functions that they were supposed to. People are just seeking appointment. They get into these commissions. They go through the motions of doing PR for government, and their salaries and allowances, and stay there for 5 years and then leave. So we've learned state has designed to capture independent institutions. So again, an individualization of memory is a bad idea in Kenya, absolutely bad idea. The second one is how do we leverage this principle of sovereignty of the people? People forget the conceptualization of that sovereignty of the people. The first position is that the people exercise their sovereignty directly. How do they do this? Actually, we have constitutionalized mass action. What does the Constitution say? That you can demonstrate, you can assemble, you can demonstrate, you can even picket. Picketing and demonstration are not the same. Picketing is much more robust, that you can even close a particular office and no one can come in or go out. So mass action, which was illegal in the past, but anyway, we carried out mass action to bring change to Kenya, is now legal. It's part of our constitutional framework. You can boycott, you can strike, as long as it's done peacefully and within the constitution. So we can even boycott goods and services. We can do many things. Also, direct participation includes participation in referendum, participation in elections. I know some people who are so frustrated, they are even giving up on elections. And personally, I think that would be a mistake. We should learn from our people who came before us and say, you should participate in all spheres of influence. Everywhere there is influence, you should seek to be there, to be counted, so that you can participate. In terms of cultural centers, yes, this is a good idea, but let's not forget, culture is always shared, but it's mainly, the large portion of culture is devolved. So we need to hold county governments accountable for how to implement this idea of culture. So it is absolutely critical in terms of saying these cultural centers should be established on the right paradigm and on the right framework, so they do not become what we have already said, something that we reject totally, that it is a cultural piece, or it's a museum, or people dressed in funny costumes, including Saiso. So the idea of cultural centers, if they're based on the constitutional imperatives, is a very good idea. So I've covered all the three in terms of memory and history, in terms of centers, and in terms of sovereignty.
Okay, we're coming to an end, and there's still so many questions. And so I want to just try and, as you know, as you start thinking of winding down, a lot of the questions have to do with what can we do? For instance, development through media has asked, how do we engage the public to make them see culture as envisioned by the Kenyan Constitution? There are other questions. Obio Biero Dhiambo has wondered if you could just mention something as we come to a close on integrity, and chapter 6, and the link between values, ethics, and culture. And then there are, I think, a lot of comments about how we think about culture, what are some of the struggles that we have to do with culture, and what is the best way forward. You know, we are, as we think about, okay, now that we know all this about culture, we want to move ahead. We want to bring the people with us. We want to use culture as a foundation. How would you propose we go about that?
I think there are many great ideas in some of the comments that have been given. But also the first one we start is to admit to ourselves that we, those who came before us and those who are here with us now, operated under much more restrictive environment and atmosphere and a single party dictatorship. And even then we were able to use culture. So culture was used during the independence struggle. Culture was used during the struggle for introduction of multipartyism and democracy in the country. And culture was used in the constitutional making process. And culture can also still be used in the constitution implementation. My brother Obio Biero Dhiambo, I shouldn't even be reminding you the performance of drum beats on Kerenyaga with or without a license, or some of the plays that were considered to be seditious. The trial of Deda Kimathi, Dario Fo's plays, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Accidental Death of an Anarchist, and many other Kenyan written plays, which were considered to be anti-state and therefore banned, and people still continue performing them under trees and so on. Music during these struggles had played an important role. We see a lot more of cinema and fashion and so on. But let me go back into the opportunities that exist under this constitution that we have not particularly used. So for instance, going forward, every time people use strategic public interest litigation, it has never been about culture. That's an avenue we can use. an avenue of proposing and even go through the development of policy. Instead of waiting for policy to come from the ministry, sit ourselves and draft the same way we did at the People's Commission of Kenya, the same way we did at Ufungamano before that, the same way we did at 5Cs and 4Cs before that. So many of the provisions of the Constitution were not developed through formal structures. First, they were developed through informal structures, and then they were tested when we got people to participate in them. So providing the leadership, one of the missing components in the implementation of the Constitution is imagination. There is lack of imagination in implementing devolution. Many of the leaders who are in devolution think devolution is enhanced former decentralized system of local government. It is not. It is based on the sovereignty of the people, because we are saying sovereignty shall be exercised at both national and county level. So lack of imagination is our problem, isn't it? So the artists, the cultural workers have not done the imagining. We have also not done the unbundling and packaging and raveling of what is contained in the Constitution. But in terms of saying, do we have baby steps? If you look at the work that is being done by Mwalimu Kimani Njogu at Twaweza, for instance, with the magazine that they have been consistent on this. If you look at what Zaid Rajan is doing with Awaz and other places, they have been at work at this. If you look at the work of young artists in music, in drama, in film, they have been at work at this. So what we need is to bring together, one, a level of awareness of the potential of the power that can be unleashed by implementing the cultural components of this Constitution. Two, we need to get organizing. And this is important. The two components of mobilizing and organizing are critical. We must organize as a sector, as a community, as peoples of this country, and start implementing. We should not wait for somebody else to come and implement for us. But also we need to roll our sleeves and dirty our hands in politics, if I may say so. Because if we are saying the political operators are the ones who are the biggest barrier to the realization of this Constitution, then we must get into that kitchen. We must. We are the many, as one scholar said, we are the many, they are the few. So how come the few are the ones who are determining the destiny of the many? We must get organized. The only difference between them and us, the few who are purveyors of impunity, those who are insistent on the status quo and returning us to the bad days, to them it's the good old days. They are very few, they are minute few. The only difference between them and us is that they are better organized, they're better mobilized, they better coordinate among themselves. That's a difference. And then the last two things. One, that we forget that the contribution of cultural related industries is the largest component of our economy. And we don't see it that way. We must start leveraging that and making a connection and drawing the attention of the Kenyans, how much fashion, food industry, film, theater, tourism, and so on and so on. How much does it contribute? Publishing, how much does it contribute to the national economy? And then the most dangerous and most challenging things that face us, which is behavior change. Again, that is the domain of cultural workers. Thank you very much. I know, Daktari, we have expanded and completed our time allocated, but thank you very much.
No, I want to thank you, Zane. That has been just so amazing. I think somebody asked me yesterday, like, we're going to speak for 2 whole hours on culture. What is there to say? And I think you have shown that we could have continued talking about this for several other hours. I think the best way of thanking you is just to quote what some of the participants have said. Kawive has dubbed you a walking culture cyclopedia. And, because you seem to just carry so much, and says congrats and thank you. Sheila Masinde reflects, she says, well, in Zane, this is the kind of learning we need embedded in formal learning and civic education for us to get a better appreciation of constitutional practices. Perhaps a better understanding of this would help us to build a culture of integrity. Joy Mboya says that, thank you very much, Zane, for a most informative engagement, and notes that there was an essential link between the Pan-African political struggle for independence and the cultural right of the peoples of Africa and the African diaspora. And she goes on to talk about how the building of our African nations on the foundations of our culture was actually part of our independence and struggles. So thank you very, very much that we've been working on the constitutional review process to redress this, and you have shown why it is so important for us to continue to do this. Indeed, as I read what Joy has said, I remember Amilcar Cabral's words, where he reminded us that national liberation is an act of culture, and that is something that we often forget. As we close, I also do want to thank every single one of the participants. The chat is so rich, not only with questions, but with comments. And we really, I for one, I'm going to save that chat just to be able to continue to think through some of the things that have been said. Thank you very much for those who joined us on YouTube, and Stine in particular for sending us questions even from YouTube. I want to very much thank Inuka, who is holding the space for us, who has provided the space for us, for being the inspiration for the Nane webinar series, and working with so many other different partners to bring every single day of this week a conversation. As I mentioned yesterday, we talked about human rights and nationhood, led by Jedida Warohio, and anchored by our brother Hussein Khalid. Tomorrow we'll be thinking about public participation and governance at both the county and national levels of government. And Purity Jebor will be anchoring that conversation with Cornelius Odwor and Cyprian Nyamwamu speaking. On Thursday, we'll go on to look at the organization and function of the 48 governments. And Regina Opondo will be hosting Shiro Gikonyo in that conversation. And then we come to an end of this particular series, the Nane webinar series, on Friday, when Atsango Chesoni will be in conversation with Daisy Amdani on the politics of amendment to the Constitution. Once again, Abubakar Zain, thank you so, so much for catalyzing such a rich conversation, catalyzing our thoughts, and let's continue to not only think about what it means when we say culture is the foundation of the nation, but working to make it a reality. You can catch this conversation and all conversations if you have missed them, or you want to go back and think through them again on Nisisi, Nisisi Kenya's YouTube platform. Looking forward to continuing this conversation tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much.